pro bono legal services. I'm not sure that was the majority's intent, but the inconsistencies result when Democrats aim to rush resolutions through the House outside of regular order. Mr. Speaker, the majority may wish to change the rules. The majority may wish to get to the finish line quicker. The majority may wish to circumvent everything that is a precedent in this House, and we've seen a lot of it over the past 5.5 months. But I wish they would take into account that they may not be the majority forever, hopefully. And that if they mess up oversight of a co-equal branch, it is on their hands. That is what the vote for yes is on this resolution. That is why a member of this body should vote no for the integrity of this House. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me just assure the gentleman from Georgia that there's nothing novel about this legislation. It's not novel because everything in this bill goes to the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group, and that's been the case in the past. What is novel, however, is a President of the United States who says that ignore subpoenas and we will not cooperate and tells people not to testify. That's not only novel, it is shocking. Mr. Speaker, and I would just say to my friends on the other side, you're going to have a choice today to either vote for this resolution and stand up for this institution and support the rule of law, or you're going to vote in a way that's going to be complicit with this President's obstruction and disrespect for this institution and disrespect for the rule of law. I urge you to vote with us. Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, Mr. Cummings.
Before recognizing Mr. Cummings, members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Maryland, Chairman Cummings, is recognized.
I rise in strong support of this resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, the Trump administration is engaged in one of the most unprecedented cover-ups since Watergate. And it's not just about Russia. It is so much broader than that. This cover-up spans across numerous investigations, and it extends from the White House to multiple federal agencies of government to completely separate outside parties. The administration officials now question the fundamental basis of Congress to conduct oversight. They object to committee rules and precedents that have been in place for decades under both Republican and Democratic leaders. And they make baseless legal arguments to avoid producing documents and testimony. The Trump administration is challenging the very constitutionality of congressional oversight, and it's happening in broad daylight. Several weeks ago, President Trump vowed, and I quote, "We are fighting all the subpoenas," unquote, end of quote. Since then, he has refused to work on legislative priorities, such as infrastructure, until Congress halts oversight and investigations of his administration. He wants us to forego our responsibility under the Constitution as a condition of passing laws to help our constituents and his constituents. The President's arguments are baseless. He suggests that all subpoenas that Congress puts out are partisan and somehow related to the Russia probe. But that is simply not correct. In the Oversight Committee, we have issued 8 subpoenas. 6 of them are bipartisan, and none of them is about Russia. They involve issues like the census, immigrant children being locked in cages and separated from their families, and the President's finances. This entire year, the White House has not produced one document to the Oversight Committee. Let me say that again. In all of our investigations, the White House has not produced one single shred of paper in response to our requests. The hurricanes in Puerto Rico, the White House has produced nothing. Security clearances abuses, the White House has produced nothing. Efforts to transfer nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, the White House has produced nothing. Hush money payments, the White House has produced not a thing. Even on issues like spending taxpayer dollars to pay for private jets, the White House has produced absolutely nothing. Over and over again, it does not matter what the topic is, the tactics are the same. And this begs the question, what are we covering up? Tomorrow, our committee will vote on whether to hold the Attorney General and the Secretary of Commerce in contempt of Congress for refusing to produce documents relating to Congress. Again, these subpoenas are bipartisan, and this issue has nothing to do with Russia. Yet the Trump administration has delayed, stonewalled, obstructed, and challenged the authority of the Congress on even these questions. I support today's resolution because it makes clear that in addition to seeking criminal contempt on the House floor, committees may seek authority to enforce their subpoenas directly in civil court actions. Nobody is above the law. I need 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
The gentleman is allowed an additional 30 seconds.
Nobody is above the law, even the President of the United States. Today's resolution reaffirms that Congress has the independent authority under the Constitution to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse and wrongdoing so that we can pass laws that are effective and efficient on behalf of all of our constituents. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support the resolutions, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Before proceeding, members are again reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentlelady from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the representative from Arizona, my friend, Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentlelady. I oppose this resolution. The subpoena for Attorney General Barr is unenforceable on its face. It demands the full and unredacted Mueller report, including grand jury material that Attorney General cannot lawfully disclose, and the Democrats know this. In a hearing last month, Chairman Nadler admitted that Attorney General Barr could not lawfully release grand jury material. He therefore admitted that the Attorney General could not lawfully comply with the subpoena. Instead, the chairman suggested that the subpoena is a starting point in negotiations. Rarely have I heard that term used with regards to a subpoena. In the Judiciary, in fact, I never heard it before that time. In the Judiciary Committee's hearing on executive privilege last month, one of the majority's own witnesses testified that, quote, one of the categories of information presently sought by the committee appears so broad as to put the executive branch to a nearly impossible task. The committee cannot in good faith expect compliance. Accordingly, the burden is on the committee to substantially narrow this aspect of its request, end quote. My friends talk about the rule of law, but the Democrats have admitted in a hearing in the Judiciary Committee that the subpoena was overly broad and that objects of the subpoena that are prohibited from disclosure, such as 6E material, were not subject to the subpoena. But they didn't fix their subpoena. They didn't issue a new subpoena. They didn't amend the subpoena. They just attempted to amend their contempt citation. Defendants' confusion over what is subject to the subpoena is adequate evidence that the subpoena itself is legally deficient as being confusing and overly broad. And a court will not be able to read the collective minds of our Democrat colleagues and will not expect such clairvoyance from the Attorney General nor from the former White House counsel. The administration is currently negotiating in good faith. We see that an agreement was reached just yesterday. The same Democrat, when discussing the assertion of executive privilege by the administration, stated, quote, these developments do not relieve the committee of its obligation to continue to negotiate. If I might have 15 more seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 15 seconds.
Gentleman is
to
allowed
Mr.
15
Biggs.
additional seconds.
Just as the subpoena is overly broad and quite frankly unprecedented, as well as legally deficient, this resolution is also overly broad and unique in the annals of American history. When the chairwoman from California referred to the President of the United States as a dictator, her language was rancorous and unparliamentary, but it seems to have been filled with projection, as this resolution provides unique authority.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this moment, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi.
The gentlelady from California, the Speaker of the House, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for giving us this opportunity to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is our oath of office. Let me salute the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction who have led us down this path with great respect for law, precedent, and the oath we take. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Congressman Cummings, Congressman Nadler, Congressman Richie Neal, Congressman Elliot Engel, one more, all of whom have been fighting the fight, gathering the facts to protect and defend our Constitution. The oath of office that we take is why we're on the floor today, to hold the Attorney General of the United States, Barr, and former White House counsel McGahn in civil contempt for their refusal to comply with Congress's subpoenas. We must follow the facts and uncover the truth for the American people. At the birth of our democracy, amid war and revolution, Thomas Paine said, "The times have found us." We are here today because the times have found us. While we do not place ourselves in the same category of greatness as our founders, we do recognize the urgency of the threat to our nation we face today. This body has a solemn duty, Mr. Speaker, a solemn duty to protect and defend our democracy, honoring the oath we take, and the Constitution that is the foundation of our freedom. That Constitution which begins with our beautiful preamble, "We the people." Immediately following those words of the preamble is Article 1, establishing a Congress in which, quote, "all legislative powers herein granted are vested." The founders conferred upon the first branch responsibilities that are sweeping in scope. We set an agenda, we hold the power of the purse, we write the laws that all of us are bound by, including the President of the United States and those who surround him. Fundamental to those responsibilities is oversight of the executive branch and all of the areas essential to the well-being of the American people. Oversight is our institutional duty to ensure against the abuse of power, protect the rule of law, and expose the truth for the people, who are the, and quotes, "the only legitimate fountain of power," end of quote, in the words of James Madison. To conduct that oversight, the Congress is both constitutionally obligated and legally entitled to access and review materials from the executive branch, which it can subpoena. Yet the President and the administration have shown an unprecedented and unjustifiable refusal to furnish Congress with that information. President Trump himself has said, "We are fighting all subpoenas. I don't want people testifying, no do-overs." His administration has employed every tool it can find to obstruct legitimate committee oversight. Everything from witness intimidation to blanket stonewalling to spurious claims of executive privilege, absolute immunity, and lack of legislative purpose. This obstruction violates decades of established legal precedent. Throughout our history, the courts have made absolutely clear that the House has the authority to follow the facts, to uncover the truth for the American people, and that the power of Congress to conduct investigations is inherent in the legislative process. Those are all in quotes. Our oversight responsibility continues to be resoundingly affirmed in the courts again and again. Last month, the District Court for the District of Columbia ruled in the Mazars Court decision, quote, "There can be little doubt that Congress' interest in the accuracy of the President's financial disclosures falls within the legislative sphere," end of quote. That same week, a judge ruled in the Deutsche Bank case that Congress's, quote, "subpoenas are all in service of facially legitimate investigative purposes." The administration's obstruction not only violates long-established precedent, it endangers our very democracy. We need answers on the many questions left unanswered by the Mueller report, which made clear that the Russians waged an all-out attack on our democracy and documented, the Mueller report documented 11 instances of obstruction from the White House itself. This is a grave threat to our democracy, but the President calls it a hoax and refuses to protect our democracy. Why is that? We take an oath to protect our Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And what the White House and the administration are doing is a danger and a threat to our democracy. At the same time, the administration's campaign of stonewalling extends far beyond the Mueller report. The administration is obscuring the truth behind the disastrous policy decisions, from attacking the Affordable Care Act coverage for millions of Americans, including those with pre-existing conditions, and taking it to court to overturn it while saying to the American people, we support pre-existing conditions and the rest. For tearing apart vulnerable immigration families at the border, for stealing military funds for an effective, wasteful border wall, for rolling back key civil rights protections for women, LGBTQ Americans, and people of color. The list goes on and on. Also in court to try to defend their abuse of power when it comes to the census, which the Constitution is very clear about, that every 10 years the people of the country will be enumerated. And they want to put a citizenship phrase in there to put a chilling effect on our getting an accurate count. The well-being of the American people and the integrity of our democracy are imperiled by this brazen behavior. Yet Senator McConnell declares, case closed, enabling this campaign of blanket, unprecedented obstruction. Why aren't the senators, we see the obstruction in this House for our trying to uphold our proceeding, but we have the votes to proceed. But the United States Senate has a responsibility to protect and defend the Constitution, and they are ignoring that. As members of Congress, we have a responsibility to honor our oath of office, strengthen the institution in which we serve for the people. We have a responsibility to honor the vision of our founders and the text of the Constitution and ensure that the truth is known. No one is above the law. Everyone will be held accountable, including the President of the United States. The People's House will continue to fight to make the truth known for the American people and will defend Congress's role under Article 1. I urge a strong bipartisan vote for this resolution to hold Attorney General Barr and former White House counsel McGahn in civil contempt for their refusal to comply with Congress's subpoenas and honor the oath of office that they take. With that, I urge an aye vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Speaker yields back your time. The lady from Arizona is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the representative from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's a reason for the abusive rhetoric from the left. For 2.5 years, they peddled a monstrous lie that Donald Trump is a traitor colluding with a hostile foreign government. They concocted it with a phony dossier commissioned by the Clinton campaign and promoted by the highest officials in the FBI, our intelligence agencies, and the Justice Department, first in a failed attempt to interfere with the 2016 presidential election, and then to undermine the constitutionally elected President of the United States. Now, despite spending $25 million on an outrageously biased team of partisan zealots assembled by Mr. Mueller, which initially included the now infamous Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and using some of the most abusive prosecutorial tactics ever employed in this country, they could find no evidence to support the lie. So what to do? Well, they had to think up another lie and think it up quick. So now we hear cries of obstruction and cover-up. Well, good luck with that. Cover-up of a crime that never happened, obstruction by turning over every document Mueller requested and even waiving executive privilege to allow the White House counsel to testify. Now, you compare that to Hillary Clinton's willful destruction of 30,000 emails under subpoena, and you get a sense of the double standard involved here. This is a desperate scavenger hunt to salvage a false narrative, and their time and the nation's patience is running out. The other shoe is about to drop. Broad investigations are now well underway and will soon reveal how this lie was perpetrated and promoted. 2 governments interfered in our elections: the Russians through ham-handed propaganda, and the Obama administration by turning the most terrifying powers entrusted to our government against our political process. The reckoning is coming. As Longfellow said, the wheels of the gods grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity for Congress to reassert itself as an equal branch of government. And the fact that there's supposed to be 3 equal branches of government, not totally accurate. You know, when we came up with the Constitution, we decided that we didn't want to have an autocratic king rule us. That's why we had a revolution. And when the men met to write our Constitution, they made Congress Article 1. There was a reason they made Congress Article 1, because the Congress represents the people. It's not a king, it's not an autocrat, it's not a despot. It's the representatives of the people to make the laws. We are supposed to really be the embodiment of, and we are the embodiment of the American people. And this president has thumbed his nose at the representatives of the people, not complying with lawful requests for documentation and lawful requests for testimony for Congress to do its constitutional delegated purpose of oversight of the executive and laws that are necessary for the betterment of this nation. This is about time Congress did act. I'm proud of Congress for bringing these bills, and I'm shocked at the opposition for not wanting the people's house, their legislative body, to stand up for future Congresses, as well as this Congress, for the rightful power that it deserves to do oversight and perform its functions with the best possible witnesses and testimony and materials that could aid it in its efforts. So I support the contempt citations. I condemn the parties that have thumbed their noses at us. Subpoena under law. They're supposed to arrive with documentation and appear to testify, and if they object, they can object there and then, not just disregard Congress's subpoenas that are lawful. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2.5 minutes to the representative from Georgia, Representative Woodall.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend on the Rules Committee for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I've been listening to this debate intently. I don't disagree with much of what my friend from Tennessee had to say. It is a bad habit that both parties have gotten into over the decades of my lifetime, putting party above article in terms of judicial oversight, executive branch oversight, and even our responsibilities here, such as declaring war. But what you have not heard here today, Mr. Speaker, and what you will not hear, is why the passage of this resolution advantages us in any way. There is not one piece of information that the Speaker of our House, our Speaker, just came and asked for that we are not empowered to request today. The difference, Mr. Speaker, is if we pass this resolution, rather than the House requesting this information, as has historically been true, we would begin to request information one committee chairman at the time. Does that advantage us in Article 1, going to court one committee chairman at the time? Or are we advantaged when the Speaker speaks on behalf of us all? I don't know the answer, Mr. Speaker. I'm not a legal scholar, and in the Rules Committee, where we had original jurisdiction on this, we did not call any legal scholars to help us answer that question. In the Judiciary Committee, they did not call any legal scholars to help to answer this question. Mr. Speaker, I tell you, there is not a member of this institution on either side of the aisle that cares more about Article 1 and us exerting the responsibilities the Constitution gives to us and our constituents expect us to do than I do. Perhaps there is someone in here who cares as much, but there is no one who cares more. Are we disadvantaging the institution for life by taking what has traditionally been the responsibility of our Speaker to do on behalf of all of us and putting it in the hands of committee chairmen? We don't know, and anyone who tells you that they do isn't telling you the truth. We're going to continue to argue about the White House and what they turned over and what they didn't turn over and what they ought to turn over, Mr. Speaker. That is not what this bill does today. There is not one piece of information that's requested that we do not have the authority to request today. Let's not move in ways that could disadvantage us for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to follow the gentleman from Georgia. I have a card in my hand. This is a member's identification. There is no designation of party on this card. This card designates 435 of us, when we're at full complement, as members of the Congress, the people's representatives. And I urge all my colleagues to use this card in a few minutes on behalf of the people and on behalf of this institution. Mr. Speaker, when Democrats won the majority in this House, we did so on a promise to the American people to hold the executive department accountable. That is our responsibility. The Constitution gives us that responsibility, and we swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. That is what the committees have been doing, and it is what the whole House is doing today. Now, the previous speaker said we have the right to ask for any information. That's accurate. What he did not then say is, we have asked and we have been refused. Not only have we been refused in the particular, we've been refused in the general, because the President of the United States has directed his people not to give us any information, not to respond to any subpoenas. Whatever the rationale may be. Why? Because he believes the House of Representatives is not acting properly. My colleagues, can't you imagine anybody who doesn't want to give us information would say, I'm not going to give it to you because you're not asking properly? Of course that's what they do. And the House, on behalf of the American people, would be unable to perform its constitutional duty. This is not political. It's constitutional. It's about separation of powers. It's about responsibility. It's about accountability. The House is exercising its responsibility to uncover all the facts and discover the truth on behalf of the American people. We represent, each of us, about 750,000 people. We're not asking in our own behalf. We are asking for the people, so that the people have the information they need in a democracy to make the decisions that they are called upon to make. In a very solemn exercise, we call it voting. Attorney General Barr and former White House Counsel McGahn have both refused to respond to subpoenas to testify before the House. And the Attorney General refuses to allow Congress to see the full and unredacted report by the special counsel, Mr. Mueller. You can see entire pages blacked out. The Attorney General's efforts to prejudge the conclusions of that report before it's released, as he did, and his public mischaracterization of its conclusions are, in my opinion, evidence of the contempt with which he refuses to answer questions and respond to subpoenas. It seems contemptuous as well of the basic principles of the rule of law and checks and balances. The American people deserve to know the full extent of Russia's efforts to interfere in our elections and subvert our democracy. You didn't have to listen too closely to Bob Mueller to understand that he believed that there was much more to be found, or to miss the fact that he said, Congress, do your duty. Make sure the American people know the facts. The American people deserve to know whether the president or anyone in his administration or inner circle of confidence were involved and tried to cover it up. Now, we've been accused of doing awful things, but I remember watching conventions where they said, lock her up. Lock her up. Flynn, General Flynn, who was the National Security Advisor, said, lock her up. Well, the fact is they locked him up. And many others associated who lied about their involvement with the Russian government, and yes, with other foreign countries. So there is reason for the Congress to want to get to the bottom of this serious invasion of our election process. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up for our Constitution and vote for this resolution. I thank the Chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern. I thank Chairman Nadler, Chairman Schiff, Chairman Cummings, Chairman Neal, Chairman Ingle, Chairwoman Waters, all who have jurisdiction over various facets of the information that is needed. And I thank the members of their committees for their hard work to conduct necessary oversight on behalf of the American people. Mr. Speaker, that's what this vote is about. I presented that card. It has no party designation on it. It just has a designation of us, each of us, as representatives of the people. Let us make sure that today we vote for the people. Stand up for our Constitution and for this House and for the rule of law. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2.5 minutes to the representative from Ohio and my fellow Judiciary Committee member, Mr. Shabbat.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution. It seeks to allow Democrats on the Judiciary Committee to go to essentially whatever court they want to get a court order, to get whatever documents they want, even grand jury documents and those that relate to our national security, all because they don't want to, or are afraid to really, hold Attorney General Barr or former White House counsel Don McGahn in contempt of Congress, just as they're afraid to initiate impeachment proceedings against President Trump, or accept the fact that the Mueller investigation found that there was no collusion and Attorney General Barr found no obstruction. They just can't get it through their heads that that's the case. And they don't want to focus on the real issue threatening our democracy, which is that Russia actually attempted to interfere in our national elections back in 2016, while Barack Obama, not Donald Trump, Barack Obama was president, and the Obama administration did absolutely nothing about that. They don't want to seem, they really don't seem too concerned that the Russians or another foreign entity might attempt to do so again in 2020. That's what they ought to be using their oversight powers, very powerful things, the power that the majority has. They ought to be using it
about that, not this charade. How many documents have the Democrats requested that relate to Russian interference in our elections? None. How many hearings? Zip. How many Obama administration officials and others connected to Russia's efforts have they subpoenaed to testify before the Judiciary Committee? Zero. By continuing with this fake impeachment, the Democrats are doing the American public a disservice. My Democratic colleagues ought to be embarrassed. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me just say to the gentleman from Ohio, let me just correct the record. The Russians didn't attempt to interfere in our election. They did interfere in our election. And if my friends read the Mueller report, they'd realize they interfered in the election to help Donald Trump get elected. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, the distinguished chair of the Committee on the Judiciary, Mr. Nadler.
The gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler, is recognized.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding, Mr. Speaker. When a congressional committee issues a subpoena, compliance is not optional. We expect witnesses to testify when summoned. We expect the administration to comply with subpoenas and to provide us with the materials we require to do our jobs. Of course, there may be differences between the Congress and the executive branch as to what information can be produced on a timely basis. When those differences arise, we are required to seek a reasonable accommodation. We first requested access to the full Mueller report and the underlying evidence on February 22nd. After refusing for almost 4 months, the Department of Justice in the last few days has finally agreed to permit us to view the special counsel's most important files. We are hopeful this will provide us with key evidence regarding allegations of obstruction of justice and other misconduct. Given this potential breakthrough, we will hold the criminal contempt process for Attorney General Barr in abeyance for now. But President Trump has blocked other key witnesses from testifying before the Judiciary Committee, including his former White House counsel, Don McGahn, whose account of the president's actions was featured in the Mueller report. The president has claimed absolute immunity for critical witnesses to prevent them from even showing up. He has invoked executive privilege to prevent us from seeing documents that stopped being privileged long ago, if they were ever privileged to begin with. He has done the same in response to Congress' important work unrelated to the Mueller report, and he has ordered the agencies not to cooperate with even our most basic oversight requests. This unprecedented stonewalling by the administration is completely unacceptable. The committees have a constitutional responsibility to conduct oversight, to make recommendations to the House as necessary, and to craft legislation that will curb the abuse of power on full display in the Trump administration. This is why it is important that the Judiciary Committee be able to act in such matters using all of our Article I powers as contemplated in this resolution and described in both the Rules Committee report and the House Judiciary Committee's contempt report. Now, I heard what the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, said a few minutes ago, and he is exactly right. This resolution gives committee chairs the power, with the approval of the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group, to go to court on behalf of the House to enforce our subpoenas. This has not been done before, but neither have we ever seen blanket stonewalling by the administration of all information requests by the House. We have never faced such blanket stonewallings. The President himself said, and they've been as good as their word, they will oppose all of our subpoenas. We must go to court to enforce the subpoenas without a separate floor vote each time if we are going to enforce our subpoenas and reject the arrogant assumption of power and by the administration and denigration of the power of the House and of the Congress. We cannot afford to waste all the floor time for every single time the administration rejects one of our subpoenas, which is every time we issue a subpoena. That's why we must do this resolution. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution so that we can get into court and break the stonewall without delay. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the representative from California, our Republican leader, Mr. McCarthy.
The gentleman from California, the Republican leader, is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, Special Counsel Mueller officially ended his investigation several weeks ago. His office is closed. Because of Attorney General Barr, his report is public, and his findings are very clear. No collusion and no obstruction. This is the bottom line of the Mueller report. But, Mr. Speaker, Democrats refuse to accept it. Mr. Speaker, even the chairman of the committee refuses to go read the portion that he's allowed to read, only 6 lines. He refuses to read it, but he wants to come here today. They continue to believe their worst conspiracy theories about the president, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Mr. Speaker, it's even reported in newspapers in the campaign to become chairman of the Judiciary Committee, one said he campaigned for the position because he would be the best with impeachment. Mr. Speaker, even on this floor of this House, there were more than 60 members of the other side of the aisle who voted for impeachment before the Mueller report was ever presented to the public. At its core, House Res 430 is just a desperate attempt to relitigate the Mueller investigation. That's why I urge colleagues to oppose this resolution. It does not strengthen Congress' oversight powers, contrary to what you may hear from the other side, Mr. Speaker. Fundamentally, it is an impeachment effort in everything but name. Mr. Speaker, just look at the unnecessary contempt citation against Attorney General Barr. Less than a month after Barr received the Mueller report, Mr. Speaker, Chairman Nadler issued a subpoena that would have required the Attorney General of the United States of America to break the law. That's not my opinion. Let's be very clear whose words those are. Jonathan Turley. Mr. Speaker, probably everybody in this body not only knows who Jonathan Turley is, he has probably the utmost respect. He is one of the most respected legal scholars in this country. Now, he told the committee, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "You have to tie your request carefully to your authority to demand information. If Bill Barr had actually compiled with the subpoena as written, he would have violated federal law. If he would have complied, he would have violated federal law." Mr. Speaker, that's why we're here. Not only, Mr. Speaker, does the chairman of that committee ask the Attorney General to break the law or he will try to hold him in contempt, he won't even go read the report. On May 8th, only a few weeks after the first subpoena was issued, House Judiciary Democrats voted to hold A.G. Barr in contempt, the Attorney General of the United States in contempt. Why would they vote to hold him in contempt? Because they were so angry that the Attorney General wouldn't break the law. They wanted him to break the law, then you won't be held in contempt. In a May 24th letter to the Attorney General, Chairman Nadler offered for the first time to negotiate and narrow the scope of his subpoena request. But then you know what? He changed his mind. Yesterday, the Department of Justice reached an agreement with the Judiciary Committee to turn over documents related to the Mueller report. Now, if the public's watching, this just looks so disorganized. You wonder, from that committee, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't they know better than to ask the Attorney General to break the law? Mr. Speaker, wouldn't you know that when you get to this point in a career, that you wouldn't be so upset that someone just doesn't do exactly what you want and then you ask you to break the law, that you'd vote to hold them in contempt and force your side of the aisle just to vote that way? That's not how it's happened in this body before. If the public wants to see a good example of congressional oversight, then let's look at something that's comparable. The House's contempt vote against Attorney General Holder in 2012. The House Oversight Committee took 2 important actions before suing in federal court. First, it negotiated with Attorney General Holder in good faith for 15 months, not a few days. It never asked him to break the law either. Narrowing the scope of its original subpoena, only extensive back and forth negotiations failed, did it vote to hold him in contempt. Second, it got the full House to vote on it and prove, you know what? A bipartisan contempt. Now, I'm not sure why this committee of the judiciary, Mr. Speaker, would not know this, but I did a little research because I was here during that time. You know why they didn't realize it was the best way to do it and it was bipartisan? Because, Mr. Speaker, a lot of them stormed outside of the chambers. Yep, you heard me right. Even though 17 Democrats voted in favor of the criminal contempt resolution against Holder and 21 voted to enforce civil citation, a number of them stormed outside and protested, took their ball and ran home. Mr. Speaker, I guess the public looked at it just throwing another fit. Now that's pretty significant. As many of you remember, it was contentious. I remember, Mr. Speaker, watching then Minority Leader Pelosi, Minority Whip Hoyer, and Congressman Nadler lead 100 Democrats off the House floor to protest the vote. Mr. Speaker, you won't see that on our side. We believe in the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, we would have done the exact same thing the Attorney General did to Jonathan Turley said, that you would have had to break the law to try to appease somebody's own personal vendetta. The idea that, Mr. Speaker, that someone would run for a position to say that they'd be best to impeach somebody and even vote to impeach without even having a report, and then when you get a report and you could go down and read just those 6 lines that you want to complain about, but you won't. The same person, Mr. Speaker, that would run outside and say, I got elected to Congress, but I'm going to pout and I'm going to go outside. Mr. Speaker, that might be the same person that would want to bring this to the floor today. But what is so different about today than all the others? Well, we're doing something we've never done before. We're doing something that's going to take the power away of every member in this body and give it to a select few. Mr. Speaker, if this vote passes today, members of this body are going to say, don't bring it here and let me represent my own people and vote about going to court. Let's just give it really to 3 people. Let's give it to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, and to the Majority Whip. Because that's what BLAG is. I know the courts are going to sit there and say, that's not what Congress is supposed to do. Congress has never done that before. But you know what? If this new majority thinks all they want to do is make an attorney general break the law, I guess they could break every rule, every history, every point of representation there is inside this body. Did we wonder if this would happen? Do we wonder why you wouldn't take the months as they've shown in the time before and actually come to a bipartisan conclusion? I think the plan was already written. I don't know if people can talk about the word patient, because, Mr. Speaker, I remember Congressman Hank Johnson of the Rules Committee. This is the Speaker's Committee, so everybody understands correctly that it's just appointed by the Speaker on the majority side. And he said, Mr. Speaker, Donald Trump will stand for re-election again in a very short period of time, and we don't have 400 days to wait. So don't care about the rule of law. Don't care about asking him to break the law. Just break every historical trend and try to take the power away from millions of Americans, of the members of Congress who represent him here. I didn't know today would come. Mr. Speaker, I didn't know that someone would go this far. I didn't know just because someone, Mr. Speaker, despises somebody else, that an election didn't turn out the way of the desire. Mr. Speaker, I've been on losing sides before, but I'd never think I'd break the law just because you lost an election. I'd never think of asking somebody as high as office as the Attorney General of the United States of America to not give due process, to come to the floor and strip the power of 400 430 members and put it in a select few. But, Mr. Speaker, I have to be honest. I don't put anything past what this new desire is about. Mr. Speaker, Democrats say we're on a constitutional crisis, and they're right. But not because of Attorney General Barr. The true constitutional crisis is this. When Democrats can't win, they change the rules. I just heard it on the floor, Mr. Speaker, that yes, from the other side of the aisle said this has never been done before. And yes, this is nothing this House has ever desired to do, but it's also no way to govern. The American people deserve a majority that is serious about coming up with solutions, not subpoenas. There are plenty important challenges that we can be working on to solve. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I opened the New York Times. It's not a paper that I think always I agree with, but it had an editorial, not for the first time, but for the second time. And it was talking about the crisis on the border. And as I read this editorial, I found myself agreeing with it greatly. When I read it, it talked about the border, it talked about Washington to stop dithering and do something about it. And I looked to wonder what committee would be most responsible for this challenge. Lo and behold, it was Judiciary. So I turned it on in hopes that I would see a hearing. Maybe I'd even see a markup. No, Mr. Speaker, who did I see? I saw John Dean. John Dean, who pleaded guilty in Watergate, the same individuals that's put more than 900 tweets out against the president, many before any Mueller report came forth. He was the expert witness. The same individual who's paid by CNN, the same individual who said the presidency of George Bush was worse than Watergate. I guess this new majority will go to no end. It doesn't matter if the facts don't go where you want, just change the rules. I wonder, all these new freshman Democrats, Mr. Speaker, when they swore in to uphold the Constitution, does that mean trying to make the Attorney General break the law? Does that mean giving your power away to a select few? There is a crisis on the border. The New York Times knows it. The country of Mexico knows it. I think almost everybody in America knows it, except, Mr. Speaker, I guess this majority. The Committee of Responsibility is more concerned about bringing somebody in who pleaded guilty in Watergate, who makes their money off, Mr. Speaker, of writing books claiming every Republican president there is worse than Watergate, and then asking the Attorney General to break the law. That's not a legacy I would be proud of. It's not a legacy I'd want to be a part of. But, Mr. Speaker, I will stay on this floor. I will vote against taking the power away, even the power away from people on the other side of the aisle. I won't lead a protest, and I won't go outside, and I won't take my ball, and I won't run home. I believe in the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, I had the responsibility and the opportunity that I could go read the redacted portions of the Mueller report, just as some on the other side of the aisle could. It's just 6 lines. Not did I think it was just my responsibility, but as an elected official, I thought it was a responsibility, so I went. But, Mr. Speaker, the people leading this today, they have not. They think they know better. I don't know if they know better, but one thing I do know, they're changing the rules of the House simply because they cannot win. That's not the American way. Those are the reasons why we stand up. Those are the things that America unites behind, the rule of law. This will not be a day that's proud. This will not be a day that when they look back in history, the individuals who vote for this will talk about. It's one when they get asked a question later in life, Mr. Speaker, is there something they regret? They'll regret the emotion overtook them. They regret their own personal dislike drove them. I'm not sure if they're proud of the day when they storm out of the building, even though there's a bipartisan vote here. But I guess that same emotion, the same, Mr. Speaker, lack of ability to actually look at the rule of law and work towards something instead of just changing the rules because you can't have your way, that's what today's about. But the worst part of it all is removing the power of individual members and putting in a select three. But then again, Mr. Speaker, when you study history and forms of government, that's what socialism is all about. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the distinguished minority leader began by saying that the Mueller report makes it clear that there was no collusion and no obstruction. Maybe that's what you would conclude if you just read the Barr summary, which tried to cover up what the Mueller report said. But I would urge the distinguished minority leader to read the report. I'm happy to lend him my bifocals if he has trouble reading it. But the report doesn't say that. It says it doesn't say no collusion. And on the issue of obstruction of justice, it says if we were convinced that he, the president, did not commit a crime, we would have said so. That's what the report says. And I would remind my colleagues that obstruction of justice is a crime. At this point, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue today is very simple. It's simply about the right of American people in Congress to get information. That's it. All this resolution does is it allows us to enforce congressional subpoenas. These are documents and witnesses we want, and allows us to go to federal court to enforce it. That's all this resolution does. And why are Republicans so scared of this resolution? Because they know we're going to win in court. We won 3 times against the Trump administration. But why do we even have to go to court to do this? Because the Trump administration is engaging in unprecedented obstruction. And it's not just about the Mueller report, it's about all areas. So for example, right now, the Trump administration is suing to eliminate health care coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. We want to know more about that. We can't get it. We want to know about a lot of areas that we cannot get, so we want to go to federal court to get this enforced. And what are Republicans doing? They're making stuff up. They're saying somehow we're asking the Attorney General to do things that will make him violate the law. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. And I'm just going to end with this simple example. The Attorney General of the United States gave the Republican ranking member of the Judiciary Committee the right to see their unredacted Mueller report. Was that illegal? No, but I can't see it. That is wrong. There's no basis for that. We're simply going to go to federal court. We're going to litigate it. We're going to win. And all this resolution does is it allows us to enforce congressional subpoenas in federal court. It's about not allowing the Trump administration to cover things up. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the representative from Texas, Mr. Gohmert.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is about harassing the president, and it's about delaying the inevitable. I would have hoped that my friends across the aisle, especially in the Judiciary Committee, that had concerns in 2005 and 6 about the overreach that was possible through the FISA procedures, would have seen that there was no collusion, that the Russians did try, but nobody with the Trump campaign bought. And so we're left with the fact that the real collusion here was between the Clinton campaign with Fusion GPS, hiring a foreign agent, Christopher Steele, who talked to people he now admits could well have been agents of Vladimir Putin, who gave false information about Trump, the candidate, that was used in a dossier that was used to manipulate the FISA court into giving a warrant to start spying on the Trump campaign. That's what this was about. And what people are calling obstruction of justice is exactly what you have when you have somebody falsely accused of colluding, conspiring with the Russians, and he knows he didn't do that, and he sees his family being harassed, and everybody that worked with the campaign that can be pushed and shoved and blackmailed as happened and bankrupted. You want to bring it to an end. You want to see justice done. But instead of my friends in judiciary coming together with us that have been concerned about the abuses of the FISA system so that it doesn't happen to other Americans, instead they come with this resolution to push the matter down the road a little further to the 2020 election. It's got to stop. Let's stop now. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I think it is appropriate to correct a number of statements that have been made on the floor. First of all, this is not the end. Director Mueller made this the beginning. When he concluded the report, he left a very large direction to the United States Congress. He recognized that he could not follow up because of policies at the DOJ regarding indictment in the process of the administration. And so the Congress, in its due diligence, took the responsibility not to target anyone, but to simply uphold the rule of law. In upholding the rule of law, we had an empty seat by Attorney General Barr, an empty seat by Mr. McGahn, an empty seat by Ms. Hicks, Ms. Donaldson, and we hope not an empty seat of the author of the report. So all this resolution does is authorize the committee to seek civil enforcement of its subpoenas against Attorney General Barr, requiring him to provide Congress with the key evidence underlying the Mueller report, as well as the unredacted report itself, and former White House counsel Donald F. McGahn, requiring him to provide documents and appear for testimony. He's not covered by executive privilege. In fact, executive privilege does not cover his duty is to the White House office of the General Counsel, or the White House counsel's office, not to the individual office holder, the president. He has personal lawyers. And we didn't break the law. 6E, which is grand jury materials, our committee diligently said, let's work with the Department of Justice, go to court and decide what we can see. We are simply following this little book that many have died for, and that is the Constitution of the United States. And those words in the Declaration of Independence that said we all are created equal with certain unalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The American people would not want a nation that did not hold.
I yield the gentlelady an additional 1 minute.
The gentlelady is allocated an additional minute.
The American people would not want a Congress that turned its back on, frankly, the rule of law. And for those of us who had the special privilege of going to Normandy this past week, you got a great sense of pride, of the courage of Americans, the bravery of those young men. And all I could think of is how important it is for all of us to adhere to those wonderful principles. So again, there is no targeting here. This is not a way to do policy or legislation. We can fight that battle on the floor of the House. But if you read those volumes and end it in the last pages of Volume 2, you know that Director Mueller asked us to finish the task of looking into elements that he did not or could not and the underlying issues. Let me also say, as we do that, we do it forthrightly, because in 2020, we want to make sure that every American has a right to vote, and every American is not undermined by a foreign operative interfering and taking the election away from you. I support the resolution. We must stand for the rule of law. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the representative and fellow Judiciary Committee from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding time. And I want to recognize the gentlelady from Texas for her remarks, because as a fellow member of the Judiciary Committee, we all stand for the rule of law, and I too carry a Constitution with me. And the Constitution explicitly creates a system that is representative of the people, where the people are elected by their constituents to come up here and represent their views in Congress and vote for them. It's not to come up here and to hand off control, to hand their vote to the majority leader, to the speaker, and to the majority whip, and to let them vote for them and for the people of their district whether or not to go to court. The votes to enforce subpoenas, the votes to hold in contempt, should be votes of the representatives of the people. That's why this resolution today is such a travesty. Mr. Speaker, I've only been a member of this body for a few months, and I was proud to be named a member of the Judiciary Committee. But unfortunately, the circus that I've witnessed over the last few months is shocking as the Democratic majority tries to find some reason, any reason, to impeach this president now that the Mueller investigation has wrapped up with no crimes found. If they want to go back and repeat the last 2 years of the investigation, the millions of dollars, the hundreds of subpoenas, they are certainly entitled to do that, but I would argue it would be a waste of time of the American taxpayer and the American people. You know, we had a hearing earlier today on the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, and the chairman did a masterful job of arguing in favor of that legislation, of which I'm a co-sponsor. It's bipartisan legislation. It's going to be marked up tomorrow. That's the way that this Judiciary Committee should operate. Instead, we have hearings with empty chairs for the Attorney General. We have a hearing with empty chair for the White House counsel. Finally, yesterday, we had a hearing with people in the seats, but they were all MSNBC and CNN commentators. Mr. Speaker, this is a travesty of justice. I would urge my colleagues to defeat this resolution.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you. The Committee on the Judiciary is one of the most venerable in the House of Representatives, and I am honored to have been selected to join its ranks. It has jurisdiction over intellectual property during a time of exponential scientific breakthroughs. It has jurisdiction over election interference during a time when we are concerned about Russians interfering with our election. It has jurisdiction over immigration issues during a time of an unprecedented security and humanitarian crisis on our southern border. I am disappointed to see how the Democratic majority has chosen to waste this authority. I am disappointed to see that it has chosen to ignore its responsibilities to the American people in favor of sound bites and photo ops. Instead of legislating, the Democratic majority prefers posing with buckets of fried chicken for the national media in crude attempts to undermine our president and his administration. Really, it's time to move on and tackle the real issues that Americans care about. The American people elected us. They elected me to Congress to get things done. Let us secure the border. Let us improve health care. Let us improve education. Let us stop this political theater that happens meeting and hearing after hearing in multiple committees, and what I believe is a blatant attempt to influence the 2020 presidential election using taxpayer resources. Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
The gentlelady reserves her time. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I have no further speakers. If the gentlelady is through, if she yields back her time.
Thank you. I have an inquiry. How much time do I have left and the other side have left, sir?
The gentlelady has 1 minute remaining.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to use my 1 minute to talk about these, to actually refute these blatant allegations and fantasies, I believe, by my fellow Democrats. And that's how somehow the President and the Department of Justice has been stonewalling them. Let me go over the timelines real quick. On March 22nd, the Attorney General immediately notified the chairman and the ranking members of the House and Senate Committees on Judiciary that they had received the confidential report from the special counsel. The next day, the Attorney General informed Congress of the special counsel's principal conclusions. March 29th, He updated the Congress on what could be done and what redactions had to be made. Then on April 18th, less than a month after receiving it, the Attorney General made the redacted confidential report available to Congress and the entire public. The same day, the Attorney General released the confidential report and made the minimally redacted version of the confidential report available for review. Mr. Speaker, I would urge a no vote on this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady's time has fully expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I yield myself the remaining time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my friends on the other side, have responded to this legislation with the same old, same old. They're circling the wagons around this president and his team. They are deliberately turning a blind eye to the corruption, to the deception, to the illegality that has surrounded this White House. But let me remind them all of why we're here today. We're here because the American people elected each of us to write laws and to ensure those who execute them are held accountable. We all took an oath when we were sworn in to uphold and defend the Constitution. That's our job. None of us were sent here to play defense for the President of the United States. There are some things that are more important than politics, and I hope that even in this day and age, there are still some things that are more sacred than partisanship, like the rule of law and the separation of powers. Each of us took the same oath. We now have a choice whether or not to uphold it. The choice should be a simple one: to stand up to President Trump and to defend the Constitution. I remember when many of my Republican friends ran for office claiming to be constitutional conservatives. Well, this is your chance to back up your campaign slogan with your vote. We have a president that publicly states, we're fighting all subpoenas, and I don't want people to testify. Those are his words. Those are the words of the president, not some mob boss. And as we heard from the chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee, Chairman Cummings, the White House hasn't turned over a single document, a single piece of paper that his committee has requested to do their oversight work. Not one piece of paper. At the core of this resolution is Congress getting the appropriate documents so we can do the appropriate oversight. That's part of the job. How can anybody be against that? To be against that is to be part of the cover-up, is to be complicit with the obstruction that this White House demonstrates each and every day. I remind my colleagues that history will judge how we react to this moment. So I urge all of my colleagues, do not let this moment pass us by. Vote yes on this resolution, and let's hold the President accountable. Nobody is above the law in the United States of America, not even the President of the United States. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I urge a yes vote.
The gentleman's time has expired. Members are again reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. All time for debate has now expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the previous question is ordered on the resolution as amended. The question is on agreeing to the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I
The gentlelady
ask for
from Arizona.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the resolution will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2608. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 229 and the nays are 191. The resolution is adopted without objection. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2609, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar number 71, H.R. 2609, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish the Acquisition Review Board in the Department of Homeland Security and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.